Okay, let's give another 5-10 seconds. As I can see, some of the attendees are joining in. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Design-Led Digital Transformation. I am Sahil Pasrija, part of Northern Membership Team. Welcome you to today's session on behalf of NASSCOM. So in this session, we learn how to offer real-time content to create a highly engaging, intuitive, and satisfying experience that caters to the unique requirements of your customers by leveraging the power of advanced data analytics, machine learning, emerging technologies, and artificial intelligence. To share insights on the same, we have two senior leaders from EY, Mr. Thiru S. Vengadam, EY Global Delivery Services Consulting Digital and Emerging Leader, Bikram Dasgupta, EY GDS, Consulting Emerging Technologies Leader. We'll take questions at the end of the session. Please put in your questions in the chat or Q&A box, whichever is convenient. Now, may I request Thiru and Vikram to please take over. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me all right, Sahil?
Sorry?
Can you hear me all right? Is my audio
Yeah.
okay?
Let me also share the screen.
All right. I'll let you go ahead and share. But firstly, thank you and NASSCOM for the opportunity for Bikram and I to present and share our experience-based insights. When the slides are on, I'll get going.
I hope that's visible.
It is, it is. Can you pop it in a presentation mode, Sahil?
Yeah, already done that.
All right, that's great. There's a little bit of lag, but I think this is good, Sahil, right? So, good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, this topic is a quite a loaded one in terms of the range of things that can be covered in this. So when Bikram and I came up with this topic in terms of sharing our experiences, there is a lot that we need to package and condense and so on. So as we go into some of these slides, I want to be kind of carefully deconstruct. What do we mean by this? Design-led is a very, very wide term, and underneath that, the transformation itself is also a wider term. So we can have, hopefully useful set of exchanges today based on our journey, our experiences. In EY, particularly through a and through digital journey, we've had over the last few years significantly rapid journey, almost exponential in many ways in terms of size, scale, process maturity, industrialized way, using repeatable patterns to solve problems. So we've grown pretty rapidly over the years, and then part of that rapid growth has been attributed to a very systematic, thoughtful, experience-based way to industrialize various components of it, right? So let's understand a little bit on each of the keywords on the title itself before we go into some of the inner insights. So first is, if you look at anything that most firms are trying to embark today, is all about transformation. Transformation is essentially business-led, right? Transformation is for solving large-scale business problems, whether it is completely changing the way you run your business, completely changing the way you pivot your data model, let's say moving from a very product-centric to a more customer-centric way. There are so many different objectives that CXOs set for them to be able to enable those transformations. Now, these transformations are typically driven by technology, driven by, especially, digital solutions, driven by data, driven by emerging tech and futuristic way. But an underlying common element of all of that is a fundamental design thinking. Design-led is the key. And then when we talk of design, it's always human-centric, right? Design need to work. Design need to work for people. Design need to provide experiences that are creating value, that are received by and processed by your, whoever is experiencing it, which results in behavior that is greater for adoption, that is greater in engagement, that is greater in retention, that creates greater scale as well, right? So when we're talking of design, there's so many elements in it, but at a core tenet of it, what we're talking about is designing experiences that matter to whom, matter to pretty much everyone that is involved, but broadly today, there are four categories of it, right? Experiences of your customers, experiences of users. I mean, most of you are aware the difference between those two. Experiences of developers who are part of it, your technology team, everybody that's part of it, and experience of your employees. Each of it matters. And when you thoughtfully design system solutions that is across these dimensions, it really comes out, very well. That really enables your transformation in a very, very powerful way, right? So that's why when we talk of transformation, the amount of importance that needs to be given to design and focus on experience is significantly high and sometimes overlooked as well, or sometimes experience and design broadly is trivialized to like maybe coming up with user interfaces and so on. So that's where we want to kind of put design in the front and center of it as design-led digital transformations. So we were also not trying to cover all things transformations. We want to focus on transformations that are having a strong digital flavor to it. That's where we can give a lot more granular views as well. Again, just to keep the scope lighter, focused on today's conversations. And that's how the starting point of this topic came about. So if you flip to the next slide, Sahil. Yeah. So here there's a lot going on the slide in terms of the what, why of experience design. But I think I want to kind of layer on top of what I said earlier in terms of additional dimensions that come into play. So when we're focused on designing experiences for a variety of stakeholders, including your own internal and external folks, there is multiple aspects to it, right? Fundamentally, one aspect that comes into play, particularly today in an event-driven world and asynchronous messaging world, is being able to provide those experiences in a real-time, near real-time manner. So anytime when you think of experiences, whether it is developer experience, where you want to, let's say, bring in additional, solutions for your service mesh, or if you're, doing some, Prometheus-based monitoring, it's all about real-time, near real-time for you to be able to process, events and signals and be able to respond to it. Second element of it, another dimension, which is actually itself is a multidimensional one, is for your solutions to be reactive, elastic, and responsive in nature, which means that as events evolve, the systems need to be able to calibrate and adapt and so on. So back in the days, about 5 years ago, when you talk of reinforcement learning, you're happy as long as you've calibrated your model once and be sure that the model is able to adapt to behaviors. Now the calibration also need to be a continuous exercise, and replacing one model with another is a painful challenge. Now where the research is going on and tendency is, can we have the model itself become dynamic over different cycles? It could be economic cycle, business cycle, whatever it is. So the calibration is also done in an incremental manner as opposed to a one-time way. So there is this need for real-time, near real-time in all angles, whichever way you look at it, whether it is a simple engaging with the customer when a customer lands in a location where you're able to respond to it, or whether it is adapting, making your models adaptive, or making your systems intelligent. There is this dimension of keeping it real time and keeping it elastic and responsive in nature. Then there is also another common element which we see, whether you're solving a tech problem or a business problem or a consumer engagement problem. It's always the wider ecosystem is in, right? It is not about you create one solution and then focus all things around that solution. It's always highly integrated with the broader ecosystem. So for example, airlines previously were selling seats. Now they're talking about experiences end-to-end, right? Where how you engage with your payment ecosystem, how you engage with the broader ecosystem, airport, the lounges, the things that you provide in the airline, in outside, the transportation outside, the whole experience is starting to matter. Same way for consumer banking, same way for anything that we even technology, right? So for example, previously it's okay for me in a highly distributed solution to look at logs from different systems and be able to manually connect. Now we're looking at end-to-end transaction monitoring, even for messaging systems. So again, it needs to be integrated, right? So there is always this wider ecosystem in play. Again, when we're thinking of experience design, we need to be able to be very, very mindful of the wider ecosystem when we do it. Omni-channel is something, it's already a bit dated concept now, because the experiences are not just in one channel, one platform, it's coming across in so many different ways. Not just from devices, but way beyond that as well. So how do we make sure that experiences are consistent and equally responsive, equally real-time across all the channels? And then, of course, the biggest and piece of all of that dimension is emerging tech, right? There is so many newer ways that things are just swept under our feet that this is probably the most difficult one to adapt, because the rest of it is all here, present, and here and now. For us to be able to adapt, we have reference points, we have evolving, cloud native foundations that are coming up with, tools and ecosystems to solve. But emerging tech, it's still pretty much a greenfield in so many ways. So Bikram, it'll be great for you to share your experiences, particularly leading that for a long time.
No, thank you very much, and thanks for having me into this conversation also today. Let me just give you a little bit more context to what you said, Thiru, already, right? It's extremely important when we think about connected ecosystems as how do we ensure that the experience that is across one of the ecosystem is leveraged in the other ecosystems as well as you move through that, right? A very simple example of that would be when you are at home, in your couch, or you're surfing, or you're in an entertainment zone, you're basically in a smart home, ecosystem, right? And and that that is basically an integration of several IoT and smart edge, kind of devices that provides that network and provides that personalization when you are in that location, correct? And then when you move from home to your car, your ecosystem changes. And I'm just simplifying this a little bit in terms of people and audience who will be able to understand how an individual, one person moves from one ecosystem to another ecosystem and how this context keeps changing, right? So when a person moves into a car, it becomes a smart car ecosystem, right? And there are different personalization and different habits and different behaviors that are demonstrated when he's driving, correct? And when you move from a smart car to your smart office or your smart retail, that completely changes again. So these are very, very simple examples. And in our way of looking at it, that the experience, the hyper-personalization, or the experience design-led transformations are going to be the connective tissue that's going to really hold the way we manage the engagements between each of these ecosystems as a person navigates from one to another, right? So having said that, I've already given examples of few ecosystems. And if you do a deeper dive on each of these ecosystems, you will realize that what I'm really talking about is the next era of IoT and smart devices that is coming in, correct? Which means a lot of sensor devices, a lot of edge infrastructure that is coming in. And with the whole rollout of 5G public and private network, right? This is only going to amplify. And the data sources that are going to come in are going to be transmitted, generated, and consumed more and more at the edge, as predicted by Gartner as well. So there are multiple things that are on the emerging tech side, which we can talk about in the next slides as well. But I'll hand it over to you, Thiru.
Sure. So yeah, let's go to the next slide, Sahil. Yeah. So here, I mean, there's just a few basic statistics just to emphasize the importance of design and experience and so on. I'll let you assimilate those numbers, but I want to kind of let you think about an important aspect while you assimilate all of it, right? So it's pretty straightforward. We're all clear on saying, all right, number one, design, and experience-based things. It is technology to data to everything is actively enabling it. We're able to create more and more intel. We're able to, process all these events and be able to, engage with people in real time on all the dimensions that I mentioned. But there is also a data element to it. And, again, commonly we all understand there's privacy laws all over, CDPR and others that ensures that a certain level of privacy is protected. But even then, there is this notion called unified customer identification, which is pretty popular, but is also pretty controversial in a way in terms of how do we manage or how do we take care of the risk associated with all of this increase in significant amount of tracking and data gathering. Is how much is too much? Where does the line get drawn? And then there's so many things that is still not fully covered by CDPR, right? For example, there is actively data providers who are still CDPR compliant that can provide monitoring and tracking of data across different channels, either for commercial reasons or for otherwise, either within your enterprise or external that can be brought in. That if you look for patterns across channels, you would still be able to identify individual customers across channels. So these are cases where they can be even before they become a customer, right? So if you look at that, there is active thought process in the industry in terms of when we talk of customer experience, employee experience, and developer experience. They're also looking at prospect experience, which is one stage before customer, can you understand your prospects? So for example, your customer base today should be, today would be in a certain demography, but you want to start looking at, let's say you want to sell it or cross-sell your product for a completely different demography who are not your customers yet. There is data available, that is approved and so on, that allows for you to be able to analyze and look for channels and whatnot and to start creating custom prospect experience. In theory, that should be okay, but then there is also, it gets very, very tricky. So there is this huge element of risk around data privacy, around, interpreting customer behavior or using this data to infer on customer behavior, where there is several levels of balance that need to be there. From an AI perspective, explainable AI kind of comes into this territory a little bit where inadvertent, behavioral aspects are not driven, but from a data perspective, also these are, hot topics. And there is a number of data providers like Chief Martech and several others who are Signal.io, Segment.com. All these are, have sufficient amount of approved data, legally valid data that takes care of propensity that belongs to different, same person across devices, same person across different channels and so on. So it's a very interesting topic as well, that as much as there is this sudden surge in, elevating experience through intelligent data, elevating experience through intelligent technologies, there is equally a balance on the other side in terms of managing the risk in a very, very powerful way. So we don't affect privacy of individuals. We don't do the hyper-personalization to the other end that it becomes creepy, or we don't, have a discriminatory outcomes in our products because of all of that, right? So that's the kind of trade-offs for us to think about upfront when we're looking at the newer emerging, experience-driven landscape. So Bikram, I don't know if you have any incremental thoughts on this.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, and with new technologies coming in, this is becoming even more complex, right? Thiru. So if you think about the rollouts of 5G, there is this new concept called 5G slicing, which basically allows you to create that tunnel and provide you a dedicated channel, which you would be able to consume the data and consume your, experiences, right? With that spoken, we're also seeing a trend in the industry where, as I said earlier, from a core, computing power to a cloud computing power, we're looking at more towards an edge-based computing power, and data is going to reside more at the edge infrastructure. And we're looking at, processor-led, intelligent systems. For instance, we're looking at GPUs, we're looking at FPGAs, etc., which is going to be significantly, intelligent enough to run a lot of these algorithms, which is AI, ML, centric, to provide that hyper-personalization to a particular individual, right? But at the same time, what we've also realized is to run a machine learning, and 95% of AI is today machine learning, but it takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of human interventions, right? It requires a lot of data sets. But when you look at, edge, or you look at new technologies, you may not have data set at the edge in that volume, right? So we're looking at other components or other technologies within AI, which is called machine reasoning, which allows you to navigate through, right, all these different infrastructures, the complex network infrastructures of cloud, core, and edge, and provide faster resolution along with machine learning when you think about it. And that's the reasoning aspect is more human reasoning, logical reasoning. So it's all ties back to the whole concept that we're talking about. It's about an individual, it's about a personal experience, right? And how do you do it with different type of technologies, including AI, ML, and AI machine reasoning into the mix.
Excellent, exactly. Yep. So at least, just a quick recap before we, look at the next one is a little bit more reference model that we came up with out of our experiences across a number of, a large amount of these, transformation engagements driven by design. Is this, we looked at broader design, per se, why it is important that in across all transformations. We looked at particularly focused on experience design, experience to everyone, experience in terms of making sure that the value that you provide are received in a way that your customers or end users can engage in a repeatable way, can be scaled, can retain with you, can continue to adopt that in a faster way, and can contribute to greater or improvement on this, right? So that's the experience that we're talking about. And experience has multiple dimensions to it, in terms of responsiveness, temporal angle, in terms of other dimensions, looking at broader ecosystem, not being narrow and so on. So that's kind of contextualizing what we're discussing. And then we moved on to the other sides of it as well, particularly number one, from an emerging tech dimension, what are the evolution there, how things are shaping up, how experiences need to be in the future. And then we also looked at particularly the risks aspect in terms of privacy, in terms of your model predictions going wrong, or inadvertent like discriminatory behaviors coming into play as we accumulate too much of experience-driven data in an event-driven way, experience data coming in event-driven way, and crossing all of that, right? So those are some of the high-level setup that we have. Now, if you flip to the next slide, let's kind of look at this into one box. Too much going on here, but we'll layer it carefully for us to process this properly. So there are four key boxes there. I'm going to touch upon each of them, but at least before I go into the walkthrough part of it, just in terms of how we're going to approach it. So step one, I'm going to kind of take time to articulate the definition of each of those boxes, what they mean, and how they come together. Step two is a little bit on the flow per se, how the non-linearity of the flow and how those are important. How do we really calibrate it? And particularly when we look at flow, there are some advanced concepts coming up like continuous architecture and others. How managing feedback loop across design, how do we do effectively for us to gain a lot of value for our customers? And then we're going to look at fundamental pillars that enable a design transformation, right? What are those tenets of those pillars? How do we ensure, so any organization, when they're working on bringing about a design-led digital transformation, what are those fundamental pillars? How do you work through that for you to be successful in that, right? So that's mainly the 3 or 4 themes that we're going to look at in this slide. So let me start with the box one, which is all the different types of experience that I mentioned earlier: employee experience, your customer experience, UX, and user experience, and developer experience. So first is let me start with developer experience, a little bit closer to that topic. So today, a lot of these organizations, a lot of the digital transformation is driven by a highly effective, highly tech-driven developer ecosystem. One of the things that any organization looking to provide high-end transformation to clients need to make sure that their developer ecosystem is pretty robust enough and forward-looking. So, for example, a couple of years ago, having your end-to-end dev stack from ADO to your SonarQube to Qualys to a basic fundamental working DevSecOps process would be sufficient enough, but not anymore. Today, for example, there are just so many other elements of developer experience that matter, right? For example, especially in an event-driven one, monitoring a transaction end-to-end across completely distributed system is a key element of developer experience. Because if you don't provide that, or if you don't work on it early on, your designers, developers, your entire delivery team will not be in a position to respond or solve problems effectively. So that's an important thing when you're solving problems, to think about what kind of developer experience am I providing, right? Today, if you look at broader incubating ecosystems, Kubernetes alone has at least 10 different products around it, which can help you greater deployment or orchestration of your images and so on. So that ecosystem is also rapidly evolving. There is huge amount of newer solutions coming up that allows for you to process events that are in an unstructured way, like Tremor.io and others, which helps you to process events and be able to react to it very, very quickly. Because otherwise, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, I know we've seen challenges where your solution is event-driven, but very, very difficult for you to make intelligent recommendations on those events, right? Because gathering the data, aggregating and seeing patterns across would be so painful, and traceability would be so painful that you wouldn't do. There is a lot more efficient monitoring. Previously we had like Prometheus and others. Now there is a lot more efficiency on top of the monitoring that's coming. Grafana is opening up into not just like a good old world, IT tech monitoring. My background is a lot on math modeling. Today, Grafana has opened up significantly onto math modeling, which we never had those kind of monitoring capabilities in the past, right? For example, when you run your stochastic calculus models or a partial differential equation models, you used to or Monte Carlo or any of those, The model execution is very, very decoupled from model monitoring. So model monitoring is a separate activity, kind of, after, kind of after the fact type of things. Now, Grafana provides great integration as models react to new data coming in, as models output vary, as prices vary, as convergence errors start coming up. Grafana is able to capture that and provide that, right? So there is a big evolution of monitoring ecosystem, that's coming into play. But what I'm saying here is all of these are going into developer experience. Now, when you're saying you care about your developers, if you're not, and this is just very, very small part, there's also platform engineering from a DevSecOps perspective. There's completely changing integrated tool chains, SRD, site reliability notions coming into it. So if you look at that, it's a massive bucket on its own to provide an experience to our developers that are cutting edge. And if you do that, what they can provide in terms of providing, like a transmitted experience for your customers is going to be very powerful, because they have all the equipped, they're equipped really well for you to be able to solve your customer experience challenges really well. Similarly, for employee as well, it's not about just experience alone. So, when you're thinking about how your employees are going to be involved, let's say, part of, let's say, mobilization of team or, project management, FinOps, what kind of solutions do you provide that they're able to provide meaningful insights in a timely manner to your clients, right? So that matters a lot. So before we even go into customer experience, these are all peripheral things that we need to take care of in an ecosystem for you to be able to provide customer experience. Otherwise, it's pretty obvious that you may say a lot about customer experience and saying, look, you have a lot of data in your side, we'll help you crunch it. And then, here are some insights. And from these insights, here is some, behavioral patterns that we help you with. But if you don't have the underlying machinery, then, all of that is going to fall significantly flat when it comes to implementation, right? So that's why that part is extremely important for us to think through, especially on EX, UX, and DX before we go into the customer experience and solving for that, right? So that's part one of that. Bikram, feel free to chime in. I'll pause there if you have anything to add on that component as we move on.
No, carry on. And this is quite valid, actually. We generally look at design from a very external perspective. And we think that whatever we're designing is more from our consumer lens, right? Which is absolutely correct. But at the same time, we need to have an inward view as well from a developer lens. And I think where we miss the bus is this aspect, because if we don't do that more effectively, we don't have scalable models and repeatable models as well. So I think you're bang on the topic. So let's carry on. We'll add more examples as we move on through this topic.
Sure, Bikram. Yeah. So if you look at the number 2 pillar, this is the architecture build deployment. It's a little bit lumped in a from a context of design led. I'm kind of bundling that all. I don't want to overwhelm with like 20 different process steps. But the importance of that is, firstly, architecture used to be like a one-time where you do your HLD, LLD, and then your level 3 design, and then you shut the shop. In a way that used to be 15, 20 years ago. And we know over time that evolved a little bit more for at least some level of periodic, let's say, architecture review boards and cabs coming in, where the architecture is reviewed or validity of it is reviewed, and some kind of feedback loop went in from your development process back into architecture. If your architecture was suboptimal, how do we do to calibrate that? What kind of tech debt accumulated in architecture that can be resolved, and so on. Now, clearly, from that kind of a legacy mindset, I think a lot has moved on to say, look, firstly, there will be architecture patterns as well, whether it's infra, whether it's solution, whether it's enterprise, whether it's cloud, where you go for those repeatable patterns and then be able to calibrate from there. I think that part of an architecture is heavily shifting into a powerful integration-driven architecture, naturally because of the business, expectations as well, that things are not a siloed solution, is more an ecosystem holistic play. Therefore, it's important for architecture also to be a lot more integration focused and a lot more security focused around that. And also that is evolving, which means that the engagement of architecture is a lot more detailed and continuous, but there's also now evolution into continuous architecture, where at sprint level, there is constant calibrations go on that results in feedback loop going to change the architecture at the top also very actively. So there is the notion of agile coming in very, very tightly from an architecture standpoint as well. And design from an experience point of view, and then the front end and other developers' point of view and their architecture, there is a very powerful trio that is coming together, right? And I think if you were to look at, more from a, let's say, like a React-like framework, React kind of simplifies this idea. I just want to use that as a reference for design-led, right? It simplifies the idea in terms of saying there is props and then there is state, right? Props are your static properties. When you're building your front-end systems and so on, I just want to use that example to link it back, right? So when you're building your front-end systems and so on, you have your design engineers on one side who've done your, Figma and other mockups and all this stuff. You take that, you define your objects from that and whatnot, where you go actively to look at what are my props, which are the static ones, what are my state, which means how you manage states will be different. Ultimately, it's just one render, but the dynamics of state, which is data that changes over time and behavioral and whatnot versus things that are flat, you solve for them very, very differently. One is a lot more like intensive, less of thinking, more mechanical. The other is a lot more thinking intensive and whatnot. But these two dynamics come together effectively with design for you to be able to solve problems. Same ideas apply in a broader design-led transformation as well, where you need to be looking at data and experiences that are going to keep evolving and reactive versus those that are more fundamental framework and structure. And the ones that are continuously evolving and whatnot is where all the continuous engagements will happen from architect's point of view, from designers' point of view, developers. So that's the main connection on number 2. Number 3, essentially is something that we're all very, very familiar with. I'm going to go a little bit light on it, which is, the agile model. I mean, I think enough said on agile in general, because number one, not only is everyone familiar with the concepts, but also understand the nuance that it's heavily about the mindset, right? A lot of people follow Kanban boards and scrums and whatnot, but don't have the mindset at all. So here, this is what we're talking about really is the mindset for you to be able to adapt to product backlogs well, and in an industrialized way, particularly, for example, when you're building stories, it is not about what, your pod builds. It's holistically across the board, right? So today, most of our large-scale transformation work, you do across 10 different components simultaneously, one feature going across all of that, right? Now you need to be, and in a way that one feature is atomic in nature. For example, I cannot introduce a new capability around a payment model and then just leave it out from a UI, hoping that somehow it'll work, right? Either the payment model goes here and corresponding changes in UI, corresponding changes in backend, all of those are applied in an integrated way, or they're all rolled back in an integrated way, right? Or deployed in a canary model that is consistent with each other. So the important point about Agile there is for us to think through in terms of how is this going to holistically pan out? Are we in a position where across the board, we've, like even including a DevSecOps and release train management and everything done in a consistent way? Now, who provides that integrated view? The product owners and the designers, right? So they have the holistic view when they're designing systems. They're not looking at just a basic screen. They're looking at it holistically. So they can map out those product backlog items for you to say, this is one atomic unit built by 8 different parts for 10 different components. Now, when they go together, that's how they need to go together, right? This is how you do what we call a steel thread model, right? Incrementally, you build these in a consistent manner across all of those cycles. That's the role of agile delivery. And then the last one is DevSecOps, which is evolving more into DevStarOps, covering governance, covering security, covering several other things, combining the developer and the ops part of it. So this is another evolving piece. So these are 4 fundamental elements where design plays a central role in all of it. I'll maybe pause, Bikram, if you want to add anything before we go on to other dimensions of this.
No, I think you've captured everything. It's basically when I think more from an emerging tech unit on this, right? We're looking at breaking this into 3 different models for us, right? One definitely which addresses the event side of the equation, right? Which is about the patterns, the aggregations, etc., and whatnot, right? And because it is more IoT, it is also sometimes geolocations and geospatial data, etc. That all gets captured through the channel within the event hub, right? That we're talking about. The second aspect, and this is coming more from this point number 2 over here on the slide, is when you think about the technology architecture, what are the various channels and what are the various ways you should be looking at in creating a more scalable architecture, because your the sources of the data can move from web channels to any other sources of data sources as well, and which creates the complexity, right? So what we've seen is we've seen also real-time learning models coming in, right, which you spoke about in a bit of predictive and adaptive, learning models that comes in, which actually handles the customer or the client's state of data, right, as well. And then how do we learn asynchronously and provide the data predictions, etc. So that's the second model. And third is the interaction history, because it's extremely important, as I said in the previous stage. As you move between one ecosystem to another ecosystem, you need to be coherent in the way you are leading the overall engagement points, and that is captured in the interaction history. So for us, these three dimensions add a lot of value in the way we deploy and in the way we build the technology architecture around it as well.
Exactly. So yeah, I'm just checking the time as well. I think we have about 7 minutes to wrap. So I'm gonna maybe add a couple of more points, and then hopefully we can bring this to a pause for questions after 3:45. So one important dimension that I want to talk about, which is not in the picture, but for us to think through, is for you to get to this level of maturity and interaction and so on across different stages. A key element is to think about what are the founding pillars, right? So number one, you need to have a developer ecosystem that is very well thought through, right? For example, the ways of working need to be very well defined. I mean, I think post-COVID, we all went through a significant calibration of ways of working, in terms of distributed teams. I think that continues to matter. Forming communities matter a lot. And again, organizations have different levels of maturity. For example, in our own case, there are certain communities where we're reasonably advanced. There are certain things we're still incubating and whatnot. But the notion of communities play a significant role, because communities tend to continue to work on intelligent accelerators, assets that makes a very big play, right? Over and over, as you solve certain type of problems, that is, two things that naturally come up. Number one, patterns, right? Even for our own design, we have a huge amount of patterns in our library for us to be able to leverage and reuse effectively. So when we know, okay, there is a payment model, we're able to flip through a palette and say, okay, what kind of payment models do you want? And then take that and bespoke it. And if that is a robust way, we use that as an additional one. So there is a pattern dimension that comes through. The other dimension is accelerators assets that standardizes ways of interaction. For example, as trivial as how will your date picker interact and pull data from the back end to how will your search filters work, how will your all those little things, and then how will your network manager work, how will your basic authentication work, how, whether it is bio driven or not. So all of those combinations, the more accelerators assets that you have in your toolkit, the faster it is. And typically communities do an effective job of it, right? So of course, when you're delivering engagements, those are all there, but communities take a care in terms of standardizing it, in terms of making it available for you to be able to cleverly reuse. And there is huge amount of such needs that exist across the spectrum. The other one, for us to think about is a constant research, right? So this is something that Bikram, I know your team plays a role as well. But high level, I want to add, and I'll let you add something as well. Is an active commitment to research, thought leadership, pilots, point of views, and so on different things. For example, we do it. We have some partnerships with the academia as well for us to do some work on it, on emerging topics, future topics, current topics. For us to be able to say, and these are all like granular problem statements. They will not be wide. They will not be, for example, how do we use quantum computing for, VAR model and everything is not what we look at, right? We look at a lot more granular, one problem statement at a time and say, like, can we go generalize this, partner with academia, partner with our own research team and do. But then there is also this whole notion of emerging tech that Bikram, you and your team are doing a number of research, a number of pilots that has been successful. So maybe if you want to give more color on that pillar.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, it's very niche, and we have to join hands with a lot of our partners and alliances in the kind of work that we do, whether it's IBM or whether it's other partners that we have in the foray for quantum that we're talking about, or Microsoft, etc. We do a lot of our work in terms of quantum computing, which is respected which is pertaining to a particular industry, because you will not be able to stand up a lot of these applications independently if you have to do it on your own, right? And there are Qiskit libraries, and Microsoft has its own, which you can really use to do some research around that. So that's just on the quantum computing. But apart from quantum computing, there is also research that was done with telecom providers in the space of 5G latencies and the use cases around it, the scaling factors. How are we looking at workload management, etc. When we look at TensorFlow kind of solutions, which are more embedded edge at AI, right? How does this really work? So there are hardware, there are network providers, there are solution providers, there are cloud providers. So research is around all these ecosystems that we need to stand up and do more rigorously, so that we can stand up a solution at a production scale for our clients, right? Because it's extremely important to all this that you mentioned, which I want to also give back, is keep in mind the non-functional requirements whenever you do it, right? The data volume, how do you ensure that you do the right workload capacity, your autonomous, event management systems, ensuring that there is no leakage of data and whatever has come in has gone out, etc. Right? And there's a proper transparency and the way you maintain and manage the history of that. Everything has to be tied back in this industry, right? So it's extremely important that we do research in all these events and across the entire life cycle, wherever there are, changes between hardware and software, and also between the infrastructure networks.
Yeah. And an important aspect, especially on like the other side of what Bikram said so far, is to make sure that this research is calibrated, tied to your customer experiences. So there is an active feedback loop in that. How do you take these diverse market signals and to create meaningful opportunities for your customers? So the thinking through about customer engagement is another very important one, in terms of how do you really, engage. I mean, this is not, when I say engagement, it's not just about, having points of view or doing demos and so on, but more importantly, in terms of the existing work that you're doing, can you bring those new value and show to customers and get validation? If that is helpful, find ways to solve real problems as well. So there is that other reality as well, right? As much as there is deep on research, there is also equally focused customer experience part of it, where that feedback loop is very, very interconnected. And again, design enables that in a very powerful way, right? So that's the add-on to it. We have only 1 minute left. So next slide, I'll let you flip it, but I'm going to keep it a very, very, few seconds short. So this slide is mainly like one granular direct example in a very, very simplified way, just to say, okay, now we understood the process. You have all of these considerations. How do you really solve for, let's say, a particular, client's case where you want to bring in, certain dimension, like, transformation of your, or bring in some type of personalization on. So this is a very, very generic framework that kind of helps you think through that, right? Step one, in terms of, identifying your current landscape and whatnot. And step two is like figuring out why would you want to solve it? Like what makes sense to you? Because there's, more often than not, there are ground reality that hits you where you may not have the same start from zero type, design solution. It'll always be, it's already moved to a certain level. It's either bytes or as rebuilt, or I'm particularly, tied to, let's say, a particular vendor, and I want to bring my solution based on that. So that kind of provides the initial, value of your design journey. And then from there on, you say, okay, now that I've pivoted or tethered my design-led transformation to those initial constraints, now let's see what all can we do. And then there's an execution journey. So this is kind of a very simplistic framework for us to say, okay, so this is how one can take the design-led digital transformation approach for solving client problems, right? So we thought it'd be easy to, a real life example and, put it into a simpler framework for people to assimilate and relate to. So that's kind of the overall picture. So maybe a 1 minute recap, and then I'll pause for questions or interactions. So we looked at design-led digital transformation as a holistic journey. We started off with thinking about, like, why experience matters, and whose experience are those, and what are the dimensions of that experience that is very, very important. And then we looked at particularly the risks associated with it. So we'll have to be mindful of it as data balloons up, as technology comes into play, as more and more personalization, as more and more, engagement with your users and customers come into play. How do you really balance, or what are the key considerations to keep in mind, so you don't have adverse or consequential, outcomes coming out of your work? Then we looked at the broader framework and key pivots around it. Number one, in terms of how does the reference architecture work for design-led transformation? What are the interaction points across those layers? And then we also looked at what are the modern dimensions on top of it in terms of making everything continuous and live, and how do you put a structure around it? We looked at that. And then particularly from an emerging tech dimension as well. And then we looked at some of the foundational pillars that needed to be there for an organization to be successful in implementing all of it. And that was, for example, looking at a developer ecosystem that is thoughtfully built with communities and ways of working. Another startup, a proper research machinery that is either directly or with your vendors or with your alliances or with industry or academia or your own research that effectively focuses on converting market signals and others into meaningful opportunities for your clients by actively engaging with your clients and be able to validate, right? So this is kind of the framework. And lastly, this slide was just a simplified example of how to bring it all together, right? So with that, Sahil, back to you. If there are specific questions that you think you want us to address, happy to get on.
Yeah, thanks, Thiru and Bikram, for such an insightful talk. Before we get questions, I have a query. See, I understand that hyper-personalization is the need of the hour, and wherein it enhances the overall consumer experience. But what are the steps that one needs to ensure to control the data leakage and the data privacy? What are the steps that one can follow?
Yeah. So my initial reaction, Bikram, I'll let you jump in as well, right? So my initial reaction, I think number one, what is very, very important is the personalization objectives that you're going after need to be ratified by the business in a very, very clear way with well-established boundaries, right? More often than not, the violations and the crossing the line happens at a lower level where that understanding is not there. And then they see data, they see patterns, they get excited, then that due diligence and validation is not there, or a lack of clear understanding of what problem are we solving. So for example, if you're attempting to understand your prospects, then you need to be clear on what is in, what is out, that kind of a boundary from the top, right? For example, when you're looking at demographic information, certain level of personally identifiable data cannot be part of your research and so on, right? So those kind of high level boundaries need to be there. So it's very clear, number one, from the top, what is the business objective? What are the boundaries? And making sure that that's sufficiently communicated and so on. Second is you need to very, very actively look at your sources and put huge amount of quality gates upfront to make sure that your sources are, vetted, reliable, industry, validated, and have evidence of compliance to, global regulations as well. And, not just global, right? Global regulations and standards, right? NIST standards need to be there. There is different standards that apply. There is global regulations apply. Your local juris applies. For example, Singapore MAS has a lot of detailed regulations on it. The US SEC has regulations on it. California has a Consumer Privacy Act. So we need to be clear on which juris are we solving for, and can we look at those and be sure that our vendors are held accountable for that level of standards? Because that ensures straight away a huge amount of filtering is taken care, and what you're dealing with is real data, right? That is just from a data point. After that, of course, the other controls come into play in terms of whether your models are explainable or not, whether your models comply with it, are they likely to produce patterns that are inherently biased and so on. And we've seen a number of public examples like those, right? So that those are the model aspects of it, and then there is execution, right? So this is how we need to approach that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Sahil, so your initial requirement is the main part, right? Where you have to understand what is your requirement, and therefore what is the data set of the data attribute that you need for it. Often we have seen that we take a lot of data, right? But it is not required for a need from a business point of view. So calibrating at the first level, that if you're really doing it at a persona basis, you really need to know an individual's data. You can have group classifications around it by age, by certain parameters of regions, etc., etc., etc. Right? So you don't really need a personal information for that, right? Similarly, when you're looking at activities, so end of the day, your objective should be how do you get the data categorized and classified into groups, rather than getting into too personal informations that you are actually using in your application or in your architecture, which something should be controlled. The other aspect is in emerging technologies, and we do a lot of this, is we do a digital profiling. And this is basically something that we do as a individual moves from and smart wearables, right? When you wear, a watch to your phone, and then you move to your head-mounted display on a metaverse. We ensure that there is a proper authentication and digital profiling of that particular customer. And while we're doing that, it actually allows you to choose as an individual what data you want to use and access in that channel. So it gives you that opportunity to choose that, which is a part of the design again. So you should give that option in the design to an individual, what you want to share to get what kind of services, right? And that, I think, is a part of the architecture and the design that has to be put up front, and understanding the right requirements, and then putting the right, whether it is cyber or whether it's the right controls and processes that you need to put into to ensure that you are not, cross-sharing that personal data across the ecosystems.
All right, Lisa. So this brings me to another question that I was thinking is that what does hyper-personalization mean to different sectors? I mean, if we look at be it fintech, health tech, or retail.
So I would view it slightly differently, because at least, my take on it is a lot of these personalizations, or the patterns of personalization, are comparable. But these, like if you look at the last slide, I've actually categorized some of those personalization as well. I think that's the patterns that we're seeing, right? For example, there is persona-based personalization, which means that you form cohorts based on a certain type of either demographic characteristics or behavioral patterns, financial purchase patterns, and so on. And we want to be able to customize to those in a meaningful way, either at a cohort level or at an individual level, depending on that degree, right? So the way that we need to understand is personalization can be based on multiple dimensions, and within each dimension, you can either personalize at a cohort level, or go to a named level, or go even deeper than that, including their social network link and pattern based, right? So, for example, if you're looking at let's say like some kind of a vacation company, for them, that personalization goes a lot deeper. It's not just about you as an individual, but it's actually who you come with and experience that, right? For example, if you go with your colleagues, based on that social link ecosystem, your experiences will be very different compared to, let's say, you going with, let's say, your kids or family, where you may have a completely different set of definition of fun and experience and so on. So in those cases, that goes not just as an individual level, but also even deeper in terms of who you come up with, how do you share that experiences, and what patterns are those, right? So that's one dimension of it. And then the categories are either persona-based, activity-based, and channel-based. There's personalization depending on certain channels. In certain channels, that kind of personalization doesn't make sense. In other channels, that makes a lot of sense. So these are different patterns of personalization that we've seen. And the consumption of it across sectors has been similar. The business context will vary, of course, but the consumption of it across sectors have been, similar. Is my initial take on it. Bikram, I know you have deeper experience on this as well.
So, and it's very similar to your point of view as well. It's just that there are some specific sector-driven context use cases, right? From a health point of view, it is very patient-centric. While it is different from a travel or a bank, right, which is more consumer-centric. So, and for each of these different personas, which is like a patient, you have different standards in the way you interact and operate with data. Let's say for health, you have interoperability standards, HL standards, right? FHIR standards. You have to maintain all of that to then contextualize the right data attribute and provide the right data services. And kind of use cases that you see around it is personalized care, right? Which means that you move across the ecosystems. You can be in the hospital, you can be on your video consulting, you could be in tertiary care or secondary care, as long as you're getting a virtual care, which is much more personalized, right? Which would mean a lot of data moving from your personal data, your health data, moving across ecosystems, which needs to be under the standards of HL7 interoperability. when you can move all of that, then you are providing a personal care. So there would be a contextual difference only on what just Thiru explained with respect to certain industries like banking, health, etc. But otherwise, it's very similar.
Okay, thanks. I see a question in the tab. It's by Alan. So the question says, one thing that he mentioned was machine reasoning. What other emerging techniques would have impact in personalization and behavioral pattern finding?
I have one initial reaction, but Bikram, I'll let you chime in with the emerging techniques that you've specialized more on. So particularly for behavioral pattern, there is huge amount of efforts going on, right? So complex event processing is this one common thing that I see right on top, right? So the notion is also fairly simple, but it's challenging in implementation. So the notion is you look for patterns over space and time. Those patterns initially are, let's say, rule driven, but you can start replacing those rules as well from a machine learning based inputs that can go in. So essentially this one, so the idea is, let's say, for example, like a very crude example, right? So let's say you're visiting, the mortgage page of a bank, 5 times in the last 1 month, right? And let's say you're already an existing customer of the bank and who's having a mortgage. And then, you're just trying to, explore this a bit. So then what this one looks for is if, for example, you put a simple rule that observes over time to say, okay, if the person visits certain type of pages regularly, and if the person has, let's say, a disgruntled, customer conversation, or if there's delinquency in the last 90 days, then you combine those two and say, now these two events that happen over space and time mean that a financial behavior pattern of this person has, let's say, challenges with respect to, meeting the monthly requirements of your payment. And they would say, look, maybe we should trigger a behavioral event where you can actually reach out to the customer and say, look, you know what, we can help you with a reduced interest rate for, let's say, a period of 3 to 6 months or whatever, for you to be able to meet that. And then it's back on or something. Now, that is personalized. That is based on complex events that happen these. So today, the most of the effort in that is more from a rule-driven algo, but that is also evolving into a machine-driven algo where you can take these events and be able to predict patterns and start engaging, right? But that's where all the moderation also comes into play. But Bikram, if you want to add other techniques.
No, absolutely. I think it's a great question. Completely aligned to what you mentioned, Thiru. I'll just elevate the response in one more way, right? It's just not the algo only aspect over here. So so what I mentioned as well is the movement of of where the computing is happening is now moving more towards what you call it as processor-based computing, right? So what we are seeing in some of the examples when we do in emerging technologies is we are looking at FPGAs coming up over CPUs or GPUs as one of the computing high-end spectrum, which is allowing a lot of these personalizations to be driven, a lot of these behavioral pattern findings to be driven. Now, the point is, how do we connect the dots between these, right? So if you think about the example of what FPGAs is, right, it's basically take an example of a video, and if you want to decode a video, the CPUs decode a video 1 pixel at a time, right? And that takes enormous amount of capacity and it's a hugely highly intensive process. But when you look at FPGAs, that does collectively multiple pixels at a time, right? So it saves a lot of time. So when you do a significant volume of multi-pixels decoding on a video, it provides you better capability and understanding to get to using those rule-based, pattern-based, aggregation, the formulas and the approaches that you've written into the models. You would be able to identify a behavior much faster and much quicker than what you would have done in the CPU or GPU-based, processing units. So we are seeing a trend of both hardware-specific as well as software algorithms as well coming into play to drive better perception, better, personalization and behavioral patterns as well. So that's in addition to what you mentioned as well.
Got it. Yeah.
Okay, I see another question. Thoughts on the use of omni-channel strategy in healthcare sector?
This question couldn't have been timed better. We've got our healthcare expert right here. He's our sector leader, Bikram. So I'll let you have a go at it first.
Sure. I mean, how much time do we have otherwise, Shahil? Because this is
Couple
just
of minutes, we can wrap this
couple of
up.
minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, think about all these channels. You go to a hospital, and I was giving that example to you, Shahil, before, right? You go to a hospital, which is one channel of how you take care, right? Your care is delivered to you. Then there are various digital channels which are either web-based or mobile-based, right? We're also seeing a new age, metaverse-centric healthcare channels coming up, where the doctors are doing much more immersive, way of identification of problem statements, because they are able to look at various data sources from IoMT devices, which is the medical IoT devices, right? They are integrated to your, meta space, and you are able to look at various parameters of health, like heart, your limbs, etc. And then you use 3D pattern on top of it, 3D models on top of it to really call it out, and then the doctors can see much better. So remote patient monitoring becomes much more easier when you have such 3D rendering on top of, on top of your statistical data that you get from, pathological labs, etc. So from a strategy of what we see from a health sector is, first of all, define your care services, whether it's going to be a remote patient care, whether it's going to be value-based care, and if it is more health, digital value-based care, you want to reach out to the lowest corner of digitization, where you want to bring your people onto new enabled channels, etc. Then I think your first and most foremost part of it should be to how do you maintain the data interoperability between all these channels, right? How do you provide the patient the right access and the right power to select what they want to share about their health, their dynamics, to tertiary care or secondary care or any other care centers which run such virtual care machines, right? Or virtual care channels. I think that is the strategy. This has to be interoperability standards meshed into people-centric, view of, patient-centric experiences, which we spoke about in our topic today. How do we elevate the experiences of patients as they move between one channel to another channel to take the right care from on the healthcare sector? Okay.
Perfect. Hope that answers the query. So thank you, Thiru and Bikram. Thanks a lot. I hope all our viewers find it helpful. Viewers, if you have any more queries, you can write them to us at north@nascom.in. And for all such exciting sessions, stay tuned and please log on to nascom.in/events. For all other updates, you'll see the detailed information of all our upcoming events there. And once again, I thank Team EY for this insightful session on design-led digital transformations. Thank you so much for joining.
I'll appreciate the opportunity, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Cheers. Bye-bye.